Brenda Peterson's face, usually a mask of calm, self-assured superiority, crumpled like a discarded paper bag. Her jaw hung slack, revealing a flash of expensive dental work. "Closed," she shrieked, her voice echoing across the pristine, manicured lawns of Whisper Creek Estates. Her manicured hand, adorned with a sizable diamond ring, pointed frantically at the new, imposing signs hammered into the ground. Each sign declared, in bold, undeniable lettering, "Trails closed indefinitely. Private property. No trespassing." The perfectly groomed gravel paths, her cherished, Whisper Creek nature trails, the very heart of her daily morning power walks and her beloved evening birdwatching expeditions, were gone. Just like that. Sealed off. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for someone, anyone, to explain this unbelievable outrage. How could her trails, the pride of the HOA, be suddenly shut down? And more importantly, how could this happen just days after she made sure his noisy, disruptive hunting was finally, definitively stopped? Brenda stomped her foot, a tiny, impotent gesture against the solid wood of the new barriers. She couldn't have known then, as a cold dread began to slither through her perfectly organized thoughts, that the closure of these trails was directly tied to the very thing she had fought so hard to eradicate. She had drawn a line in the sand, but it turned out that line was just the beginning of a much larger boundary shift, one that would change Whisper Creek Estates forever. And the man she had so confidently tried to silence was only just beginning to make his voice heard. Life in Whisper Creek Estates had always been pretty quiet, like the calm before a gentle rain. For me, Dave Miller, it was the perfect spot. My house sat at the edge of the community, where the green lawns gave way to something wilder, thick woods that stretched for miles, filled with the rustling of leaves and the calls of hidden birds. This wasn't just any patch of trees, it was my sanctuary, my escape, and my hunting ground. I loved being out there, not just for the hunt itself, but for the quiet, for the feeling of being a small part of something much bigger. It wasn't about trophies for me. It was about connecting with nature, understanding the rhythm of the seasons, and providing food for my family with my own hands. I'd grown up learning about the land from my grandpa, who always taught me to respect every living thing and only take what I needed. He said, "Dave, kindness isn't just for people, it's for the earth too." And empathy, well, that's seeing the world through the eyes of a squirrel or a deer, knowing their struggle, and honoring their life. Those words stuck with me, shaping how I saw everything, especially my hunting. Most folks in Whisper Creek were good neighbors. We waved, chatted about the weather, and sometimes helped each other out. There was Sarah, who lived 2 houses down, always baking cookies and leaving them on doorsteps. And Tom, across the street, who'd lend you any tool you needed without a second thought. Our homeowners association, or HOA, was usually a pretty sleepy group. They handled stuff like keeping the front gate looking nice, making sure everyone's grass was cut, and organizing the annual block party. It was mostly calm, no big dramas. We all pretty much understood that living in a community meant a little give and take, a bit of looking out for each other. Then Brenda Peterson moved in, 2 years ago, right into the big corner house with the perfectly trimmed hedges. She was new to the area, had just moved from a big city, and quickly joined the HOA board, saying she wanted to make Whisper Creek even better. At first, she seemed fine, a bit bossy maybe, but friendly enough. She organized a new recycling program, which was great, and got the streetlights fixed faster than anyone else ever could. People started to call her Brenda, the fixer. But then, the little things started. First, it was notes in mailboxes about trash cans being left out too long. Then, it was emails about lawn gnomes being non-compliant. Soon, it wasn't about big problems, but tiny details that Brenda seemed to find everywhere. I tried to be welcoming. I brought over a plate of Sarah's cookies when Brenda moved in, just a friendly gesture. She thanked me, but her eyes scanned my yard, lingering on the small shed where I kept my hunting gear. I remember she said, "Oh, you're the one with the outdoorsy hobbies. There was a strange tone in her voice, like outdoorsy was a disease. I just smiled and said, "Yep, love being out in nature." I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. One Tuesday, after a quiet morning hunt where I'd managed to get a nice buck, I came back to find a formal-looking envelope tucked into my screen door. Inside was a crisp, white letter from the HOA, with Brenda's name at the bottom as Board Liaison for Community Standards. The letter stated, in very polite but firm words, that there had been a complaint regarding the discharge of firearms within community proximity. It wasn't a warning, just an observation and a reminder of community safety guidelines. I knew it was Brenda. Nobody else cared enough to complain about my hunting, which I always did far away from houses, deep in the woods on the property line. I followed every rule, every safety measure. I even had a special spot where I'd set up a target practice area, far out of earshot and sight, only using it maybe once a month, always careful. I decided to talk to Brenda directly, hoping to clear things up. I walked over to her house, ready to explain how far away I was, how safe I was, how much I valued the quiet of the community. She answered the door with a stiff smile. "Dave," she said, her voice a little too sweet. I explained my routine, talked about safety, and even offered to walk the property line with her to show her how much space there was between my hunting spots and any homes. I emphasized how careful I was, how much I believed in being a good neighbor. "Brenda, I understand concerns about safety, truly I do," I told her, trying to sound as reasonable as possible. "But I'm always miles back in the woods, on my own land, and I follow every safety protocol. I respect everyone's peace and quiet." She listened, her head tilted slightly, but her eyes were cold, like glass. When I finished, she simply nodded. "I appreciate your explanation, Dave. However, some residents find the idea of hunting unsettling, regardless of distance. It's about perception, you see. And noise. Even distant noise can be disruptive." She wasn't hearing me. She wasn't interested in facts or distances. It was about her feelings, her perceptions. I left feeling a bit confused, but still hopeful that a friendly chat would solve things. I thought if she just understood, she'd see it wasn't a problem. I was wrong. The next week, another letter arrived, this one more pointed. It talked about noise ordinances and disruption of community tranquility. It mentioned potential disturbance to wildlife on the newly designated Whisper Creek Nature Trails, the very trails Brenda was so proud of, the ones that ran right along the edge of my property, though still fully on community land. It was clear she was building a case. She started posting signs along the trails too, little laminated notices reminding people not to litter, not to disturb the natural habitat. It felt like she was staking a claim, silently, for the entire woods, even the parts that bordered my private land. I ignored the signs for a while, continuing my routine, but always being extra careful. I knew I wasn't breaking any rules, but the constant pressure, the feeling of being watched, was starting to get to me. I thought about giving up hunting, just for peace, but the idea felt like giving up a piece of myself, a connection to something important. My grandpa's words echoed. "Don't let anyone take away what you love, Dave, as long as you're doing it right and hurting no one." Then came the HOA meeting notice. The main item on the agenda, review of recreational activities within community boundaries. I knew what that meant. Brenda had moved beyond passive aggression. At the meeting, she spoke eloquently about community harmony, safety for our children and pets, and preserving the pristine nature of our beloved trails. She didn't mention my name, but everyone knew she was talking about me. She presented a new rule proposal, a ban on all forms of hunting and firearm discharge within 500 yards of any community property line or residential structure. 500 yards was a massive distance, practically covering my entire hunting area from my house. It would effectively ban my hunting completely, pushing me off my own land into public hunting grounds far away, which just wasn't the same. A few neighbors, like Sarah and Tom, tried to speak up for me, talking about how responsible I was, how I was a good neighbor. But Brenda had rallied her supporters. She had photos of deer near the trail, pictures of my truck parked near the woods, always on my property line, I might add, and even a printout of an anonymous online forum post about a noisy hunter in a suburban development. It felt like a witch hunt. Brenda even brought up the idea that my hunting was somehow scaring off the beautiful, rare birds she liked to watch on her trails. She spoke with such conviction, so much passion, about the rights of residents to feel safe and enjoy their property without fear or disturbance. Her words were smooth, persuasive, and designed to tug at heartstrings. I stood up, feeling a knot of frustration tighten in my stomach. I tried one last time to explain. "Look," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "I've been hunting here for years, long before most of us moved in. I follow all state laws, and I've always been mindful of our neighbors. I never shoot near homes or the trails. This proposal, it would mean I can't hunt on my own property anymore. It's unfair." Brenda smiled thinly. "Dave, we appreciate your perspective. But the majority of the community has expressed concerns." She called for a vote. The hands went up, a sea of votes in favor of the new ban. It was overwhelming. The motion passed. Just like that, with a simple show of hands at an HOA meeting, my hunting on my own property was effectively shut down. Brenda looked at me, a triumphant glint in her eye. She had won. She had taken away my connection to the land, my passion, my quiet way of life. The meeting ended, and as I walked out, the air felt heavy, crushing. I was hurt, angry, and felt utterly defeated. But more than that, a different kind of quiet settled over me, a dangerous calm. Brenda had closed the door on my hunting. She thought it was over. She had no idea what door she had just opened. The world outside the HOA meeting room, moments after the vote, felt strangely muted, as if all the color and sound had been drained away. I walked out into the cool evening air, the buzzing of a street lamp overhead sounding like a distant, angry wasp. The ban. It wasn't just a rule. It felt like a punch to the gut. My hunting, my quiet time in the woods, my way of connecting with something real and wild, all of it snatched away by a show of hands and Brenda Peterson's smooth words. I could still see her triumphant smile, a little smirk playing on her lips as she looked directly at me after the vote, as if to say, "I told you so." A wave of anger washed over me, hot and swift. It wasn't just about hunting, it was about principle. It was my land, my right, and I had always been careful, always respectful. How could a group of people, many of whom had never even stepped foot in the woods beyond the manicured trails, dictate what I could or couldn't do on my own property? I walked home, my footsteps heavy on the sidewalk, the anger slowly turning into a dull ache of disappointment. I thought about my grandpa again, his hands rough from years of working the land, his eyes kind but firm. He'd always said, "Dave, a man's word is his bond, and his land is his responsibility. You protect both, and you stand up for what's right, but you do it with a clear head, not with rage." That last part was important. Rage just clouded things. The next morning, the anger was still there, a low hum beneath everything else. I reread the HOA bylaws, checking every paragraph, every footnote. I searched online for local regulations, for anything that might give me a loophole, a way to fight back. But Brenda had done her homework. The new rule, while extreme, was technically within the HOA's power if enough people voted for it. There was no easy way out, no magic legal phrase that would undo it. It was like hitting a brick wall. A few days later, I was out in my yard, watering the small vegetable garden I kept. It was a beautiful morning, sun shining, birds singing. Then I saw her. Brenda, in her fancy hiking gear, was walking down the Whisper Creek nature trails, her head held high. When she saw me, she veered slightly off the path, heading towards my property line, a small smile playing on her lips. "Good morning, Dave," she called out, her voice a little too cheerful. "Lovely day for enjoying nature, isn't it? So much more peaceful now." She glanced meaningfully towards the woods where I used to hunt. Her words were like little jabs, meant to sting. I just nodded, giving her a tight, polite smile. "It certainly is, Brenda," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my frustration. I chose to turn back to my garden, focusing on the green leaves and the promise of tomatoes, rather than engaging with her taunts. I kept repeating Grandpa's words in my head, "Kindness, Dave, even when it's hard. It's a stronger weapon than anger." In the weeks that followed, I tried to adjust. I packed up my hunting gear, putting it away in the shed. It felt wrong, like putting away a part of myself. I went to other public hunting lands, miles away, but it wasn't the same. The woods were different, the feeling was different. I missed the quiet familiarity of my own patch of wilderness, the deer trails I knew like the back of my hand, the old oak tree where I often sat and watched the world go by. It felt like a part of my soul had been fenced off. My neighbors, Sarah and Tom, noticed the change in me. Sarah brought over a fresh apple pie one afternoon. "Dave," she said gently, "I'm so sorry about the HOA meeting. It wasn't fair. You're one of the most responsible people I know." Tom stopped by that evening. "Look, man," he said, leaning against my fence, "that whole thing with Brenda was out of line. If you need anything, anything at all, just say the word." Their kindness was a balm, a reminder that not everyone in Whisper Creek was against me. It made me feel less alone, and it reminded me that my frustration wasn't just about my hobby, but about unfairness, about people being pushed around. I tried to find other ways to connect with nature, to fill the quiet void left by hunting. I started hiking the Whisper Creek trails myself, the very trails Brenda was so proud of. I wanted to see if I could find a different kind of peace there. The trails were well kept, winding through the woods, but they felt tame. Manicured. Like nature had been put in a pretty little box. I saw Brenda often on the trails, power walking with her expensive earbuds, or stopping to point out a bird to another neighbor with an air of expert authority. She seemed to enjoy her newfound power over the natural spaces, relishing her role as the protector of the community's pristine environment. Sometimes, I'd see her staring at my property line, almost as if she was checking to make sure I wasn't sneaking into the woods with my rifle. Her gaze made my skin crawl. It was clear she wasn't just satisfied with the hunting ban, she wanted to assert her control over the entire wild area, even the parts that weren't strictly HOA common ground, but bordered my own woods. She seemed to believe that if it was nature, she had a right to manage it. One sunny Saturday morning, I was enjoying my coffee on my back porch, watching the sunlight filter through the trees on my property. It was peaceful, a rare moment of calm. Suddenly, I heard shouting. Loud, angry shouting coming from the edge of my woods, near where my property line met the HOA trails. I stood up, confused, and walked towards the sound. As I got closer, I saw Brenda. She wasn't on the trail. She was stomping around on my private property, maybe 20 feet past the property markers, waving her arms and yelling at nothing, it seemed, until I noticed it. A small, carefully built deer stand, tucked high in a tree, hidden from view from the trails. It was a stand I'd built years ago, long before Brenda moved in, and it was entirely on my side of the property line. It was old, unused since the ban, but still there. Brenda had found it. And she wasn't just yelling. She was trying to pull something down from the tree, ripping at the camouflage netting I had used to hide the stand. She was completely trespassing. "This is an eyesore," she shrieked, clearly not noticing me at first. "A safety hazard. And it's so close to the trail. This has to go. Her face was red, contorted in a mixture of anger and self-righteous fury. She was tearing at my property, on my land, fueled by her absolute conviction that she had the right to control every inch of the wild space, even if it belonged to someone else. My calm shattered. This wasn't just about hunting anymore. This was a direct invasion, a blatant disrespect for my property and my rights. And as I watched her, tearing at my old, unused deer stand, a new, cold resolve settled deep within me. Brenda had gone too far. A cold shock, like a splash of icy water, ran through me as I stood there watching Brenda. My old deer stand, hidden deep in the woods, on my own land, was being attacked by her, simply because she decided it was an eyesore. Her face was twisted with anger, her perfectly coiffed hair a bit messy from her efforts to tear down the camouflage netting. She was pulling at it, grunting with effort, trying to rip it from the tree. This wasn't just about my hunting anymore. This was about her walking onto my private property and trying to destroy something that belonged to me. Brenda! I called out, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my chest. She froze, her hands still tangled in the netting, and slowly turned to face me. Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. "Dave," she huffed, brushing a stray leaf from her sweater. "You're still leaving this thing up? After the HOA vote? It's completely inappropriate, and it's a blight on the natural beauty of the community. It's too close to the trails." "It's on my property, Brenda," I stated, walking closer, pointing to the faded orange paint mark on a tree, a clear property line marker. "And it's not hurting anyone. It's not a safety hazard, and it's not part of the HOA common area. You're trespassing." Her face flushed, but she didn't back down. "Trespassing? Don't be ridiculous. This whole area is practically community land. You know, for the enjoyment of all residents. And besides, that stand is a hazard, a reminder of what we're trying to move away from." She gestured vaguely towards the trees, as if my property was part of her personal nature preserve. "You should have taken it down after the vote. It's an eyesore, pure and simple." She tried to sound calm, but her voice was tight with indignation. I took a deep breath, trying to remember my grandpa's words about staying clear-headed. "Brenda," I said, my voice low and firm, "what you're doing right now is illegal. This is my private property. You have no right to be here, and you certainly have no right to touch my things. If you don't step off my land and leave my property alone, I'll have to call the sheriff." For a moment, she looked stunned. My voice, usually calm and easygoing, had a hard edge she clearly wasn't used to. Her eyes darted from me to the property marker, then back to the netting she'd damaged. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, quickly replaced by a haughty sneer. "Don't be dramatic, Dave," she scoffed, pulling her hands away from the stand. "I was simply ensuring community compliance. You'll hear from the HOA about this eyesore. Consider this a formal notice." She straightened her clothes with an exaggerated sweep of her hands, then turned and stomped back towards the hiking trail, her back stiff with offended pride. She didn't look back. I stood there for a long moment, watching her disappear into the woods. The damaged netting hung sadly from the tree. The anger was back, but this time it was different. It wasn't a hot, blinding rage, but a cold, steady burn. This wasn't just about hunting anymore. This was about boundaries. About respect. About a person so caught up in their own sense of control that they felt entitled to walk all over other people's rights. Kindness and empathy, I realized, also meant standing up for yourself when someone was clearly trying to take advantage. My grandpa had taught me to be fair, but he also taught me to be strong. That evening, I didn't go to Sarah or Tom right away. I needed to think. I sat at my kitchen table, a legal pad in front of me. Brenda thought she could use the HOA rules to push me around, to take away my rights on my own land. But I knew there were rules for everything, not just for HOAs. There were property laws, easements, and community agreements. I started researching. I pulled out my property deed, the maps of Whisper Creek Estates, and the original HOA documents. I spent hours reading, my eyes scanning legal terms, definitions, and clauses. I was looking for something, anything, that could protect me, not just from Brenda's immediate actions, but from her relentless need for control. I learned about something called prescriptive easements, which meant if people used a path across your land for a long time, it could become a public right-of-way, even if it was technically private. But the Whisper Creek trails were all on HOA common ground, or so I thought. I also learned about property lines, setbacks, and nuisance laws. My mind raced, trying to fit all the pieces together, like solving a complicated puzzle. I wasn't looking to get revenge, not really. I was looking for a way to stop Brenda, to make her understand that her actions had consequences, and that her reach did not extend to my private property. I wanted to teach her about boundaries, not just physical ones, but also about the limits of her power and influence. The next day, I called a local surveyor. I wanted to make absolutely sure about my property lines, beyond any doubt. The surveyor came out a few days later, carefully marking the exact boundary between my land and the HOA common area. He used bright orange flags and clear, permanent markers. As he worked, I watched Brenda from my window. She was walking the trails, a pair of binoculars around her neck, looking at everything, like she owned the entire forest. She paused when she saw the surveyor, her head cocked, clearly curious, but she didn't come over. The surveyor confirmed what I already knew, my deer stand was well within my property. The orange flags now made it undeniably clear. I felt a quiet resolve grow inside me. I wasn't going to shout or fight. I was going to use the rules, just like Brenda did, but I was going to use them correctly, fairly, and with a purpose she would never expect. I thought about the trails, Brenda's precious Whisper Creek nature trails, the ones she loved so much, the ones she used to justify her interference. They ran right along the edge of my property, close enough for her to spy on my deer stand, close enough for her to feel entitled to the very air above my land. Then, a letter arrived. A very official-looking letter from the HOA, with Brenda's signature prominently displayed as head of community standards. It was a formal complaint, complete with a detailed description of my unauthorized structure, my deer stand, and an official notice demanding its immediate removal due to visual blight and potential safety concerns for trail users. It even included a warning about a potential fine if I didn't comply within 7 days. This wasn't just a threat, it was Brenda escalating her personal vendetta, using the HOA as her personal weapon, demanding I remove something from my own land. The audacity of it, the sheer overreach, made my blood run cold. She had pushed me too far. Her actions had just sealed the fate of her beloved trails. The HOA letter, demanding the removal of my deer stand and threatening a fine, felt like the ultimate insult. Brenda wasn't just bothering me anymore, she was trying to dictate what I could do on my own private property. It wasn't just about the hunting ban or the trails, it was about her relentless push to control everything. The fine itself wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was the principle of it, the sheer nerve, that truly set my teeth on edge. She really thought she could just send a letter and make me do whatever she wanted. My hands clenched, crumpling the paper slightly. This wasn't just a low point, it was a breaking point. Her actions, her constant intrusions, had pushed me past being simply frustrated. Now, I was determined. I wasn't going to shout or fight with her, not directly. I was going to use her own methods against her, but with an unexpected twist. I walked straight to my computer, the crumpled letter still clutched in my hand. I wasn't going to dismantle my deer stand, not a chance. Instead, I opened up the detailed property maps the surveyor had given me, the ones with the precise orange markers showing my property line. I also pulled up the HOA's own rules, and the state laws regarding private property rights and easements. I had spent hours researching this, and I now had all the pieces. I knew something Brenda didn't. Her beloved Whisper Creek nature trails, the very trails she patrolled like a queen, the ones she claimed were for the enjoyment of all residents, actually touched my property in a very specific, crucial way. The HOA map showed the trails running along the edge of the woods, a perfect path for joggers and birdwatchers. What the general HOA map didn't show, however, was a small, ancient section of the trail, hidden behind a particularly dense clump of rhododendrons, that actually cut a tiny corner across what was legally my land. It was just a few feet, maybe 10 or 15 yards at most, where the trail curved slightly inward. It was so small, so overgrown with wild bushes and trees that most people, even Brenda, probably never noticed it wasn't entirely on HOA common ground. But the surveyor's maps, with their pinpoint accuracy and the precise GPS coordinates, showed it clearly. This wasn't a prescriptive easement either, because it was so insignificant and not consistently used by the public as a main thoroughfare for enough years to establish that right. It was simply a tiny, forgotten piece of the trail, built years ago, that had strayed onto my land. And now, Brenda's bullying had given me a reason to finally do something about it. I spent the next few days in quiet preparation. I didn't tell Sarah or Tom about my plan yet. I wanted to be sure, to have everything in place before I involved anyone else. I knew Brenda would react badly, and I didn't want to cause trouble for my friends. I ordered a new set of brightly colored, official-looking, private property signs and some heavy-duty fencing materials. This wasn't about being mean. It was about protecting what was mine, about setting a clear boundary that Brenda had refused to acknowledge. It was about showing her that actions have consequences, and that respecting other people's property was as important as her community standards. The morning came. It was a crisp, clear day, perfect for working outside. I woke up early, before most people in Whisper Creek were even stirring. I dressed in my work clothes, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and determined calm. I loaded my tools and the new materials into my truck. I drove slowly to the edge of my property where the trail snaked into the woods. The air was quiet, only the chirping of crickets disturbing the peace. I started at the point where the trail first crossed onto my property. With careful precision, using the surveyor's markers as my guide, I began to install the new fence. It wasn't a tall, imposing fence, just enough to clearly mark a boundary. And next to it, I pounded in the bright yellow, private property signs. Each thud of the hammer felt like a small victory. This wasn't about spite, it was about self-preservation. It was about defining my space, protecting my peace, and teaching a very important lesson about respect and boundaries. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky with soft oranges and pinks, I continued my work. My hands were steady, my resolve unwavering. I knew this would cause a stir. I knew Brenda would be furious. But I also knew I was within my rights. This was my land, and if she wouldn't respect my boundaries, then I would make them impossible to ignore. I cut the last section of wire and stretched it tight, securing it to the final post. The small, hidden part of the Whisper Creek Nature Trail, the part that crossed onto my property, was now undeniably blocked. It wasn't a huge section of the trail, but it effectively cut off the continuous loop, turning it into a dead end from one side and an interrupted path from the other. I stepped back, wiping sweat from my brow, and looked at my handiwork. The fence was simple, but firm. The bright yellow sign stood out clearly against the green of the woods. It looked official. It looked permanent. I took a deep breath, the smell of fresh-cut wood and damp earth filling my lungs. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control, a quiet satisfaction. I had been pushed, and now I had pushed back, not with anger, but with precision and principle. Then, I heard it. A familiar, brisk pace on the gravel of the main trail. Brenda's morning power walk. She was approaching from the far side, her usual route. I stayed still, watching, waiting. The air grew thick with anticipation. Her footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, she rounded the bend, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her expression one of serene enjoyment. She took another step, then another, until she was directly in front of the new fence. Her head snapped up. Her body stiffened. Her eyes, usually so sharp and self-assured, widened in disbelief as they landed on the bright yellow signs, on the newly installed fence, completely blocking her path. Her beloved trail, her pride and joy, was abruptly, definitively, and silently, cut off. The serene look vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated outrage. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a silent gasp of shock. Brenda stood there, frozen. Her eyes darted from the bright yellow, private property, signs to the sturdy new fence, then back to my face, a silent scream building in her throat. The color drained from her face, leaving her ashen. She blinked, as if expecting the fence to vanish, but it stood firm, an undeniable barrier across her beloved trail. I watched her, saying nothing, allowing the shock to fully settle in. She had come onto my land, defaced my property, and tried to find me for something that was rightfully mine. Now, she was experiencing a taste of her own medicine, a boundary she couldn't cross. Finally, a sound escaped her lips, a strangled gasp that quickly turned into a furious shriek. "What have you done?" she bellowed, her voice echoing through the quiet woods. She pointed a trembling finger at the fence, then at me. "You can't do this. This is a community trail. You're ruining it. This is outrageous. I'll call the HOA. I'll call the police. You'll be fined into oblivion, Dave Miller." I remained calm, my voice even. "This section of the trail, Brenda, is on my private property. My surveyor confirmed it, and the property lines are clearly marked. You were trespassing when you tried to damage my deer stand, and frankly, your constant interference on my land pushed me to secure my boundaries. I have every legal right to fence off my property." Her face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. "Your private property? Don't be absurd. This trail has been here forever. Everyone uses it. You can't just block it off. What about the community? What about the children who enjoy their nature walks? What about the birds?" Her voice was rising, becoming shrill. She sounded like a wounded animal, trapped and lashing out. It was a stark reminder of how her focus was always on her own perception, her own convenience, never on understanding others. "It might have been used for a long time, Brenda," I explained, trying to keep my voice flat, "but that doesn't make it common property. It's a small section, an oversight from years ago. And as for the community, you might recall how the HOA, under your guidance, voted to restrict my rights on my own property. Now, I'm simply exercising my rights on my own land." I didn't gloat, I didn't smile. I just stated the facts, letting them hang in the air between us. Brenda stomped her foot again, a furious, childish gesture. "This is retaliation. This is spite. You're just doing this because of the hunting ban," she accused, her voice cracking with fury. "You're a selfish, inconsiderate brute. This is completely unacceptable." "I'm protecting my property, Brenda," I replied, simply. "Just as you sought to protect what you believed was important to the community. You drew a line in the sand regarding my hunting. I'm just drawing a line on my property." She sputtered, unable to form a coherent response. Her eyes darted around, as if looking for someone, anyone, to come to her rescue. But it was still early, and the trails were empty save for us. She glared at me one last time, a look of pure hatred in her eyes, then she spun around and stormed off down the trail, away from the fence, disappearing back into the woods, her angry footsteps crunching on the gravel. Later that morning, as I was hosing down some tools in my yard, I saw Brenda again. This time, she wasn't alone. She was with two other HOA board members, both of whom usually just quietly agreed with whatever Brenda said. There was Richard, a retired businessman who loved his quiet life, and Carol, a timid woman who never seemed to have an opinion of her own. Brenda was pointing wildly towards my property, her voice still loud enough for me to hear snippets. Unprecedented. Legal action. Public nuisance. They walked up to the fence, their faces grim. Richard peered at the signs, then at the fence, his brow furrowed. Carol looked nervous, wringing her hands. Brenda was doing most of the talking, her arms waving dramatically. After a few minutes, Richard, probably sensing my presence, waved me over. "Dave," he said, his voice hesitant, "Brenda here tells us you've taken down a section of the community trail?" He looked uncomfortable, clearly caught in the middle. "Not taken down, Richard," I corrected calmly. "I've simply fenced off a section of my private property that the trail happens to cross. I had a surveyor out, the lines are clearly marked. I can show you the maps and the deed if you'd like." I made sure to emphasize, my private property. Brenda immediately interrupted. "He's just doing this out of spite, Richard. Because we voted to restrict his hunting. It's an act of pure defiance." "Brenda, please," Richard said, trying to calm her. He turned back to me. "Dave, can't we find a compromise? This is a popular trail. People enjoy it." I tried to compromise, Richard, I reminded him gently. For months, I tried to explain my hunting, to show how I was safe, how I respected everyone. I offered to walk the property line with Brenda. But my concerns were dismissed, and my rights on my own land were taken away. And then, Brenda came onto my property and tried to damage my deer stand, and the HOA threatened me with a fine for something that's on my own land. I'm simply protecting what's mine. Just as the HOA decided to protect what it believes is important. I looked directly at Brenda as I said this last part. Brenda scoffed. "He's just making excuses. We have a community to run. We can't have residents just unilaterally shutting down common areas." "It's not a common area, Brenda," I said, firmly but without raising my voice. "It's my land. That's the entire point." The discussion went back and forth for a while, mostly Brenda arguing loudly, and Richard trying to find a middle ground that didn't exist. Carol just kept looking at her feet. It was clear Brenda saw this as a personal war, not a legal issue. She was pushing. But I had prepared. I had all my paperwork, all the legal descriptions, the surveyor's official report. I presented it all to Richard, calmly and clearly. Richard looked at the documents, his face growing more serious with each page. He understood what Brenda didn't want to admit, I was legally in the right. We'll have to review this, Dave," he said, looking at Brenda, who was fuming silently. "The HOA's legal counsel will need to look at this, of course." Brenda finally exploded. "Legal counsel? For a few feet of dirt? This is absurd. We'll just tell him to take it down. He can't do this to my trails." Her possessive tone grated on my nerves. She truly believed those trails belonged to her. "They're not your trails, Brenda," I stated, my voice losing some of its calm. "They're the community's trails. And a portion of them crosses my private property. I have offered to show you the legal documents time and again. If you choose to ignore facts, that's on you. But this fence stays." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "We'll be in touch, Dave," he said, pulling Brenda, still muttering angrily, away from the fence. As they walked away, I noticed Brenda looking back at me, her eyes filled with a simmering, dangerous fury. She knew, deep down, that she had made a mistake, that she had pushed too hard. But instead of seeing her error, she just got angrier. She wasn't just upset, she was humiliated. And when Brenda Peterson was humiliated, she didn't retreat. She plotted. I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fence was up, the trails were closed at that section, but the real storm was yet to come. The air crackled with a silent, dangerous energy the moment Brenda stormed away from the newly fenced-off section of the trail. Her face, usually so composed, was a mask of incandescent fury. She hadn't just been annoyed, she had been humiliated. And in Whisper Creek Estates, a place that valued its serene, ordered existence above all else, humiliation was a weapon Brenda knew how to wield, often against others. This time, it was aimed squarely at me. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that she wouldn't let this go. This wasn't just about a fence, it was about her authority, her vision for the community, and her bruised pride. The storm was coming, and I braced myself. Sure enough, the very next morning, an email, not a polite letter, but an urgent, all-caps email, went out to every resident from the HOA. The subject line screamed, "Emergency Board Meeting, Urgent Community Matter." The body of the email, drafted no doubt by Brenda herself, painted a dramatic picture of unilateral destruction of community amenities, unprecedented disregard for resident enjoyment, and vaguely threatened severe legal ramifications. It made no mention of property lines or my rights, it was a rallying cry, designed to inflame public opinion against me. The emergency meeting was packed. The community room, usually half empty for regular HOA gatherings, buzzed with whispers and angry murmurs. Brenda stood at the front, next to Richard and Carol, who both looked distinctly uncomfortable. She didn't mince words. She launched into a passionate, almost theatrical monologue about Dave Miller's shocking act of defiance. She talked about the sacred trust of community spaces, the innocent children who would no longer be able to safely navigate the trails, and the magnificent wildlife that would now be disrupted. She pointed at a large, laminated map of Whisper Creek Estates, highlighting the small section of the trail I had fenced off, making it seem like I had cut off a major highway, not a tiny curve. She was a master of emotional manipulation, and she had the crowd stirred up. People were nodding, whispering angrily, casting glares in my direction. When it was my turn to speak, a hush fell over the room, but it was not a respectful silence, it was filled with barely contained hostility. I stood up, holding my stack of documents, the original deed, the surveyor's detailed maps, and a copy of the state property laws. "Neighbors," I began, my voice clear and steady, "I understand your concerns. But I want to be very clear. I have done nothing illegal or against any HOA bylaw. This fence is entirely on my private property." I laid out the facts, calmly and clearly, about the surveyor's findings, about Brenda trespassing on my land, and about the HOA's previous actions regarding my hunting. I tried to communicate, to explain, to compromise. But when my property was invaded, and I was threatened with fines for something on my own land, I had no choice but to physically mark my boundaries. Brenda interrupted, her voice sharp. "He's making excuses for an act of pure spite. He's just angry we stopped his hunting." "The hunting ban, Brenda, was about your perception, not safety or rules," I countered, looking directly at her. "This fence is about legal property lines and my right to protect my land from trespass and damage." The meeting devolved into chaos. People shouted questions, some defending me, some supporting Brenda. Sarah and Tom spoke up bravely, reminding everyone about Brenda's history of overreach and my good character. "Dave has always been a responsible neighbor," Sarah insisted, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "This isn't like him, and I think we need to look at why he felt forced to do this." Tom added, "Brenda, you went onto his land. That's a fact. And you've been pushing Dave for months. What about treating our neighbors with respect?" But Brenda's supporters, fueled by her dramatic narrative, largely drowned them out. Richard, looking utterly miserable, finally called for a vote, to demand Dave Miller remove the fence immediately, or face legal action and a maximum fine. The majority of hands went up, a crushing defeat for me, but I knew it wasn't the end. The vote was based on emotion, not facts. The next few weeks were tense. The HOA's legal counsel, a firm based in the city, got involved. Initially, they sent me a formal letter, reiterating the HOA's demand and the threat of legal action. It was a stressful time. I hired my own lawyer, a quiet but sharp woman named Ms. Davies, who specialized in property law. She reviewed all my documents, walked my property line with the surveyor, and listened patiently to my story. "Dave," she said, after our first meeting, "you have a very strong case. Your property is clearly defined, and your rights as a landowner are paramount. The HOA has overstepped its bounds, especially with the trespassing incident and the fine threat." Her confidence was a huge relief. The legal process began, a slow, tedious dance of letters, rebuttals, and official declarations. Ms. Davies sent a meticulously detailed letter to the HOA's counsel, laying out all the facts: my property deed, the surveyor's sworn statement, the precise coordinates of the property line, and even documented evidence of Brenda's trespassing. She made it clear that if the HOA pursued legal action, they would not only lose, but they would be liable for my legal fees. Meanwhile, Brenda continued her campaign within the community. She organized trail cleanup days, but now only on the remaining sections of the trails, frequently making comments about certain individuals who cared more about their selfish pursuits than community well-being. She had flyers posted, reminding people that the entire trail system was currently disrupted due to a rogue resident. She even held a "Save Our Trails" petition, trying to gather support to force me to remove the fence. She was relentless, trying to turn every single neighbor against me. But something interesting started to happen. As the legal back and forth continued, whispers began to spread. Richard, the HOA board member, had to explain the actual legal situation to a few influential residents, quietly admitting that Dave was legally in the right. Carol, no longer able to tolerate Brenda's bullying, resigned from the HOA board, citing personal reasons, but confiding in Sarah that she couldn't stand the unfairness anymore. Sarah and Tom, with new facts in hand, started talking to more neighbors, showing them the actual property maps, explaining how Brenda had pushed things too far. Some of the anger started to turn into doubt, then into a quiet resentment towards Brenda for misrepresenting the situation. People started to realize that Brenda's passion for community standards had gone too far, turning into a personal vendetta that was now costing the HOA money in legal fees. Then came the meeting that sealed the fate of Brenda's beloved trails. It wasn't an emergency meeting, it was a regular board meeting, but the tension in the room was palpable. The HOA's legal counsel was present, looking grim. They had finally completed their review of all the evidence, including Ms. Davies' extensive documentation. The lawyer, a serious-looking man named Mr. Harrison, spoke directly to the board, his voice devoid of emotion, purely stating facts. "Board members," he began, after a thorough review of all submitted documents, including Mr. Miller's deed, the official surveyor's report, and the specific state property statutes, "it is our legal opinion that Mr. Miller is entirely within his rights to erect a fence on his private property. The section of the Whisper Creek Nature Trail in question does, in fact, cross his land." A collective gasp went through the room. Brenda's jaw dropped. Mr. Harrison continued, "Any attempt by the HOA to compel Mr. Miller to remove this fence would result in a costly and protracted legal battle, which we advise against. Furthermore, any prior attempts to trespass on Mr. Miller's property or issue fines for structures on his property are legally indefensible and could lead to significant liability for the HOA." Brenda shot up from her chair, her face contorted. "This is preposterous. This is outrageous. We can't let him do this. The trails. The community. Mr. Harrison calmly held up a hand. Ms. Peterson, the law is clear. Your options, as a board, are either to acknowledge Mr. Miller's property rights, or to pursue legal action that you will most certainly lose, incurring substantial legal fees for the community. The realization hit the other board members like a physical blow. They had been misled. Richard, who had been quiet, spoke up, his voice tinged with regret. So, the fence stays? Mr. Harrison nodded. Unless the HOA wishes to purchase that small strip of land from Mr. Miller at fair market value, which he is not obligated to sell, yes, the fence stays. He looked at me. Mr. Miller, are you open to selling that small parcel to the HOA? I shook my head. No, I'm not. This isn't about money. It's about respect for property and boundaries. And frankly, after everything that's happened, I'm not willing to sell. A hush fell over the room. The board members looked at each other, then at Brenda, who was staring at me with pure, distilled hatred. The continuous loop of the Whisper Creek nature trails, the pride of the community, was now permanently broken by a fence on my land. To reroute the trail would mean clearing a significant new path through dense woods, a monumental task that would require permits, massive expense, and likely upset other residents whose property bordered the new proposed path. It was an impossible undertaking for the small HOA budget and resources. Richard, looking defeated, finally spoke. Given the legal advice and the impracticality of rerouting the trail, I see no other option. He took a deep breath, and then delivered the blow that resonated throughout Whisper Creek. The Whisper Creek nature trails, as they currently exist, can no longer function as a continuous system. Therefore, effective immediately, the entire Whisper Creek nature trail system will be closed indefinitely. Signs will be posted, and residents are advised that any previous access is now revoked for safety and liability reasons. A collective gasp swept through the room. Brenda's mouth hung open. She started to protest, but her voice was drowned out by the shocked murmurs of the residents. Her face crumpled, just as it had that first morning when she saw the fence. Her eyes, usually so sharp, were now filled with a desperate, disbelieving horror. Her beloved trails, her cherished symbol of control and community pride, were gone. Closed for good. All because she couldn't extend an ounce of empathy, couldn't respect boundaries, couldn't see beyond her own desires. She had fought to stop my hunting, and in doing so, she had inadvertently, spectacularly, destroyed the very thing she valued most. As I walked out of that meeting, a quiet satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about consequences, about fairness, and about the harsh lesson that sometimes, when you push too hard, you end up breaking the very thing you hold dear. And Brenda Peterson, the HOA Karen who tried to stop my hunting, had finally learned that lesson the hardest way possible.